Hey everybody, it's Carpo once again. I figured I would do this video to, I guess to conclude the previous video that I made about argument and human nature, because it cut me off at like 19 minutes, and I guess there's nothing worse than being cut off mid-sentence. I ran out of card space and I can't see on my camera when I'm running low. So anyway, I figure I left off during kind of an intense point I was making about, and I went back and listened to it so I could kind of try to tie in here, but I'm never going to be able to attack it with the same gusto. But the idea that I had was, why, when people talk about other lives, if we were to live multiple lives and that we're trying to attain this enlightenment, but our whole mission is to help others on this plane, why would we want to go back? Why wouldn't we want to remain in the third dimension? And I had said, because people are unhappy. That's just a very general statement. And what I mean by that is that this is also why heaven is such a warming, welcome idea. It's because no more animosity, no more hate, no more adversity, no more effort. And that's a big point there. But moving on to a place where you can do what you like, how you like, when you like. The thing that isn't considered often is that many of the things that we like to do aren't necessarily good things. They could be addictions, or just little habits that we have, maybe things that we like to do, guilty pleasures. These little things make life what it is, to an extent. I think that a life that's lived towards utter perfection, without enjoying any of the sidelines, is, well, I haven't lived that life, so I can't say. But really, living life and figuring out what it's all about in itself is a treat. That saying, an unexamined life is not worth living, I believe Socrates said that. The unexamined life is not worth living means that if you haven't considered who you are and why you're here and where you come from, then you die without ever questioning any of the important things in life. And lots of people do it. People die every day that have never considered anything more than going to work the next day, paying the next mortgage, how they're going to attain the next goal, what they're going to do in the retirement, neglecting all the points of being human. And it's sad, but for those who are seeking those things, you get to a point where you find, okay, that life is a big mystery, there are many answers that cannot be solved, many questions that can be answered, but ultimately, the whole root of it is we are political creatures by nature. And whether or not this is still working towards the benefit of the whole, now this goes back to philosophical roots that have to do with evolution, and I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but when you taking human characteristics that are animal characteristics into human traits, or things that we've evolved to do out of the need that it would help the group in our past. We've only begun to farm and have, agriculture and live in cities in the very last part of our human existence. We evolved for hundreds of thousands of years without anything of the sort of a farm or a large group. So we have these adaptations, these genetic traits that we no longer perhaps need. And this is the big question here. This is the root of the philosophical debate, is whether or not these traits that we have as humans, say compassion or sharing or even arguing or ego, whether or not these traits are something that was passed on from evolutionary times that we no longer need and can cast aside, or if they're things that that are in us for other reasons, for reasons that are divine or beyond our comprehension. And I think that question alone can have so many answers, but I don't have any of them. and all the philosophers who have tackled this situation have all gone down the same road. They've used the Darwin's you know idea of the ascent of man into his current state, and they've used that combined with other efforts on primate research, and derived their own conclusions about whether or not these things are things that we need. And I hope I'm expressing myself well enough here, because that's an important point, I think. Things like sharing, that good feeling you get from sharing with someone, okay? Helping someone else out. The question goes down to roots like that. Are these things that are really truly divine, or are they just things that we do for cooperative, for the group? Now, if they can be proven to be nothing more than evolutionary traits, then that would have a major impact on the way that people see behavior, because they'd say, well, that's just something that suckers do. Only suckers share with people. And, of course, I think most of us know that in the back of your mind, you kind of know which things are going to benefit or harm you, behavioral patterns. But the question comes down, again, to why we create these illusions of a better place. And it's like I said, it's because we're so unhappy with the way things are going. So what can we do about that? Well, there's two options. There's many options, but I see two or three major options. One option is to buy into the system completely, fight against it, fight against the current, and complain about everything. This seems to be what a lot of people are doing. They're completely part of the system that they hate so much, and they pull themselves into it even more and more so they can find other things to complain about it. Then there are those who are part of the system but understand how to limit their exposure and at the same time make an effort to help it and to try to improve society. Then there are those who opt out completely. Those who have nothing to do with it, nothing to do with society or organized structure of it. Now within that, there's also social groups, people who, the ones who are in the system, those of us who are forced to be in the system but don't want to be, okay? And there's a lot of us. But I'm going to go as far as to say that a majority of people are probably content. At least let's just say Americans, okay, as an example, are content with the system the way it is, don't really want to make much of an effort to do anything about it, to change it, or to get out of it. They may not be happy about the way things are going, but they're obviously not unhappy enough to really take time to do something about it. So it couldn't be that big of an impact. Those of us who are forced into the system but are trying to minimize our exposure to it, and I'm talking about governmental system, structure, organization, what society tells us is normal, the illusion, okay? The people who buy into that are, I think, the majority. The folks of us who want out have two choices, two paths to dealing with it. We can either get fussy about it and try to either change it or complain about it, or we can accept it. Okay, now accepting it means that you unconditionally accept that it is what it is. We are where we are, and you can't do much about the status of the world. And this is the approach I take personally. I'm not going to say it's the right approach. It's just the approach that I take, because I believe that I'm not going to waste my energy on things that I cannot change. It brings back that AA line. John was talking about AA the other day. He said, and that AA line was, well, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That saying, that one's followed me for life. Not from AA, but it's just some credo I followed, since as far as I can remember. Because when we fight against the current, it builds up all kinds of problems within us. Stress and anger and resentment. When we let these things go and say, oh well, I have to be here, it is what it is kind of mood. And this is the Buddhist approach. All of a sudden, looking at those green fields after life, or that eternity of happiness, doesn't seem so great. And I think this is the key, and this is where I really wanted to lead to before I go too far off track, is that how you view the world around you is going to determine whether or not you want to leave it. And you have to find a fine line between totally loving life and being content with the idea that knowing that you're going to die. And a lot of people don't like to talk about that. But it's something that I do because I believe that it's part of the whole thing. Everybody needs to remember that all the time, that you're going to die, and toy with the idea. Go as far as to think about what it'll be like when you're laying in your casket, or after you're dead, what your family will be like, what your great-great-great-grandkids might be like. And then you see that death is a process, rebirth, regeneration. You can only go so far to tell yourself that the afterlife will be great. And at one point you have to just say, I have to love the life I'm in now. Now I've heard Christians tell me that they're excited to die. More than a few of them. Because then they'll get to go to heaven. And, live in green fields. And this, to me, is kind of a determining factor in how a lot of people live their lives. This tells me that the particular group of Christians I'm talking about are the ones that have given up on enjoying the moment. All they can think about is tomorrow, getting to heaven. And I think a lot of the people, it seems like the more attached a person is to that heaven state, sometimes, a large portion of the time, the more issues they might have in their daily life, like being very poor, And on the same token, a lot of rich folks will find an excuse to not be religious because they have their heaven, their kingdom right here on earth. This is not a proper way to be either. So we have one group living for the afterlife, one group living for the now, and somewhere in between you have to be able to keep your head on straight and plan a little bit for your future, but don't be so engulfed in it that you really think that you're going to live in eternal happiness. Because I'm going to, as somebody had said on my previous video about this, that they don't agree that happiness can be, that you wouldn't know happiness without suffering. So I want to clarify for a minute what suffering means. In suffering, I'm taking this in the Buddhist approach, that suffering is anything that affects a person in a negative or adverse way, or creates an emotion that is unwelcome. And I guess I shouldn't even say unwelcome, because sadness, anger, depression, these are things that show us what happiness is. And one could argue the point that you could be happy without knowing sadness, or without knowing suffering. But I don't understand how I can really explain it better than by saying that happiness is a state that describes we're in an elated state where we feel good about ourselves, feel good about life. We have dopamine flowing, serotonin, our chemical levels are high, we feel great. That can be followed by an extreme low, because we always know that it's kind of like a sugar high. You get really high, then you get low, or like with any drug. The way your body reacts to these different drugs is, all conditional upon where you're at, who you are, all this different stuff. And as well, when you eat or do anything that creates a good mood, or even an action, helping someone, or someone helps you or gives you something, you give someone something that brings a happy state. But if you were in a constant state of happiness, you would not be able to understand what happiness was, because you would always feel that way. In time, that you would grow numb to that. It's just like a drug. People think that when you take drugs, say narcotics, right? Take some heroin, you slam some heroin, and the next time you have to take some more, right? You build up a tolerance to all drugs. Scientists have questioned why this happens, and you might be surprised that really people don't know as much as we think we know about drugs. And they ask, why do we build a tolerance? Well, most people, like me, who I've used drugs in my life, and I've always just assumed, well, you need more because your brain is keeping more of it out. But that's not true, because a lot of drugs don't even cross the blood-brain barrier, and on top of that, some of them just trigger your brain to release its own serotonin, dopamine, right? So some mimic serotonin, some create your brain to release things. Drugs don't actually affect you. Drugs release your own brain chemicals. And the drugs do different things to trick your body into releasing more of chemicals, right? So in that way, kind of lost my point there. When you're in a particular state, it's due to a chemical release, and so that it changes your behavior. If you were always happy, you wouldn't be able to understand sadness. Therefore, even if you were at baseline, like say you felt okay most of the time, and then there were times when you felt happy, and then you're okay, then you're happy, and you were never sad or never suffered, all of a sudden being baseline would become like suffering. No matter what the level is, it's just like the curve in a classroom. Whatever the curve is, whatever level you're at is going to be the norm, and you will set your own standards of what normal and what suffering is. For some people, they can go broke and not eat for a week, and that's not suffering to them. Okay? To a majority of Americans, that would be suffering. Okay? Being out of food for a week or being out in the woods. For some people, this is just normal life. And I wouldn't say out of food for a week, but say have very little, very little to eat, only a little bit of water. For some tribes and groups, this is a normal thing. Okay? For me, I can be broke and I'm not suffering. Some people who have a lot of money, that would be considered suffering to them. So suffering is really all perspective. And when we realize that all emotion is perspective, as well as happiness, what would you consider the happiest you've been? And how do you know that that's the same happiness as another person? You always, everybody knows somebody who doesn't appear to ever be happy. And you wonder, does that person ever really smile? Does that person ever enjoy his life? So, what's the ultimate goal here? The ultimate goal is to find a way to live within the system that you have to be part of, at least in Western society. And in most of the world now, you have to be part of the system. And instead of fighting against the current, swim with it and grab a raft and go like hell. And you can find a way to embrace everything that happens to you, even the negative. So when you're presented with something bad, look at it as a challenge. Say you run over a nail and your tire goes flat on the freeway. Okay? Most people go, God damn it, and the first thing they do is freak out. Change your attitude. Change your attitude right away. Say, okay, well, what's around me? What am I here to see? Who am I going to meet when I go to the gas station? That kind of stuff. Take it for what it is and embrace it. And it sounds cheesy maybe for some people, and they'll say, yeah, it's easy for you to say, my life's so hard, this and that. Everybody's lives are hard. Some people have more suffering, and therefore their perspective's different. There's some people out there those people who annoy some people because they appear to be so happy all the time. And the truth is, they're creating their own happiness. Or some of them maybe just aren't as happy as they appear to be. And the different emotional states of people determines what happiness really is. So my point of all of that is that it's another balance factor. Without that, emotional negativity will never have positive attributes in life. And so as long as we're looking for something outside of today, as long as we're looking for a heaven or a place that's different or better than where we are now, then we're not making our reality. Well, what it is, in my eyes, if I want to put it bluntly, I would say that dreaming of heaven is laziness to create a good life for oneself. And it doesn't mean that a person who believes in heaven is too lazy to do something for themselves. It means that if that's what you're yearning for and that's all that matters, then it means that you're not embracing what you have right now. And in my opinion, let's just say for the long shot, Christianity is true, and there is a heaven and pearly gates, just like everybody says. Would that God not want us to live the most fruitful and full lives here, doing as much as we can for each other? Because there's obviously a purpose for being here, not just so we can live 20 to 70 years and be judged according to how we lived in that time. Even though our environmental structures, our emotional situations, our mental capacities, everything about us is completely different from one another. And yet we would all be judged on the same actions And it just becomes a ludicrous idea. This is why I'm not religious, because I can't see that that this world would be a test for another. This world is meant to be lived. This world is meant to be lived to its fullest. So this is where we all tie together. I don't care if you're a creationist, a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, or an atheist. Because I have some subs who are hardcore Christians. I have some subs who are hardcore atheists, and I respect them both because I've seen both views. I don't know where I stand on that. I say God sometimes, but I don't believe in any force of God that is like what others think God is. God, to me, I believe that there's a superior intelligence to humans, okay? That's the only way I can describe it. A superior intelligence to humans that organizes things in such a way, yet allows for a certain amount of free will, but not determinism in the sense that things are always set in stone, okay? There's a certain amount of free will, a degree, but I won't even go into that because that could go on for hours. But we really have to come together on these points, Christians and atheists, and everywhere in between, on the points that living right now is important, regardless of what happens after we die, okay? And I can't stress that enough. Regardless of whether there's a heaven after we die or we rot in the ground, it's irrelevant to right now, completely, because we have to live our lives with values. And a Christian may say, no, it's not irrelevant because it says the Ten Commandments or this in the Bible, but all of that is already common sense to man, or it should be. Don't kill, don't steal, don't covet other people's stuff. Okay, these are things that humans have shared for thousands of years, and who knows how much longer. And so we've learned how to cope with one another by having these rules, sets of rules that we follow. And we don't have to have 10 commandments to do it. This is just, any atheist would say the 10 commandments are completely legitimate, except for, maybe a couple, not so much, but it's really irrelevant of the details of what we believe when it comes to living right now. So can we please get past trying to either convert one another to Christianity or to try to tear down Christians' values by telling them that they're shitballs and they don't know, and complaining about what the Vatican did. It goes back and forth. I find myself doing it too. We all buy into it. We get into a dispute with someone of a different belief, and we have to make our point. So we've made our points. We know where we stand. Let's get together and do something about it and find a heaven right now, here on earth. Namaste, everybody. I love you all. I really do. We're all part of the same organism.